Well, hello, Calvary Chapel 14:6. This is Nathan Marks, the social media pastor in training, and we have with us here today Pastor Pat, who is wearing a blanket, apparently, probably because it's cold in here. And then we have Pastor David over here in the corner.
Hello.
And then we have Pastor Steve.
Hello.
And you're probably wondering why I'm holding a dinosaur in my hand. Pastor Steve wouldn't let me hang this up in the corner for this episode. I really wanted to hang this up for this episode because we're talking about Noah's flood today.
That's pretty cool.
I know, it is cool. Why didn't we hang this up, Steve?
Is that like a mini T-Rex with four eyes?
I'm calling you out.
Four-eye T-Rex.
No,
That's what I'm calling that.
It's a T-Rex skull.
It's a T-Rex skull?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
That's
Is
what it is.
stomach
But
at the
Noah's
top
Ark
there?
and dinosaurs can fit into that. But that's not what Noah's Ark is. We should have Noah's Ark on the wall.
True, but we are also
Well, you know why
called
God brought the
Dinosaur
flood.
Church. So
So he can kill all those T-Rexes
That's
off.
what it was.
Why, yeah.
That's what it
Yeah,
was.
he wanted to get rid of the dinosaurs.
Yep.
yeah.
Something like that. I'm not going to comment just yet.
He's not gonna come. I can see the restraint in your face.
Because there's always that kid that's, throwing something into it.
This is going to be a fun episode. We're talking about Genesis, and I don't know if you guys know this, but Pastor Pat is an absolute nerd when it comes to anything related to Genesis, and it's absolutely awesome. He loves the book of Genesis.
he wrote a book.
He did write a
Yeah.
book on it.
Yeah.
You should go read that book. It's in the bookstore. Rich is selling it somewhere. Which one is it? Is it the
Understand
Well, you'll
the
put the
evolution of
Amazon
creation.
link down
That's
below
true.
in
We'll
the
put the
podcast.
Amazon link
there
down
you
below.
go.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Perfect.
Okay. So,
We're trolled for that one. That's
Well, we love them. We love the trolls.
That's right. That's right.
So before we start talking about Noah's flood, though, we wanted to talk about the oldest people to ever live. Now, if you guys are wondering why we want to talk about the oldest people to ever live, because last episode that we were on in Genesis, we were talking about the Nephilim, and the next chapter after that is a genealogy after the story of Cain and Abel. There's a genealogy that lists the ages of different people in the Bible, and I think the oldest person recorded in the Bible is in that genealogy. I'm pretty sure it's Methuselah. Is that right?
Methuselah.
Methuselah. Yeah.
Methuselah or Methuselah?
Methuselah.
I think
I've
it was
always
There's a
pronounced
shut in
it.
it?
Yeah, I always pronounce it
I've always
Methuselah.
Methuselah.
Yeah. But anywho, he was like, what, 960 something years?
969.
969
It's
years.
insane.
Which I don't know how they measured years back then, but yeah, that's still
Well, that's
pretty
the
old.
debate.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a
Is it the
big debate.
Gregorian calendar or is it
Well,
the lunar calendar?
Since Gregory didn't exist until what, the Middle Ages?
Yeah.
AD?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So then you
So-
go. So then the raging debate in theology is, well, it was about 20% less, 25% less in terms of years today, or 25%. Okay, so are they younger then? They older? But this is the theology that's basically arguing.
But I think the Bible kind of backs it up because I don't remember where it's at, but it does say that God basically says they will no longer live that long. So we do know they lived.
he said
much
no more than
longer
120
than-
years.
Yeah.
A couple of different times he says that too.
At least we know that, but the reason why we want to talk about it is because it's an interesting mystery in the Bible when you look at this genealogy and you have all this scripture of just these names and these big numbers, and you're like, well, what's this have to do with Jesus and God and the whole scriptures? And I think it's really cool that we get to talk again about mysteries like this in the Bible, because it's like, ooh, that's cool. So
Well, what a lot of people don't talk about is a lot of these names were coexisting. They were all living at the same time.
true.
Which we
And
don't
people
always
don't
realize.
talk about that.
No, they don't.
You think linear. Oh, there was Adam. He lived 950 years. He died. And then, you know what I mean? That's kind of how we think when we read the Bible. But that's not really the record.
No,
Yeah.
there's quite an overlap.
I bet they saw dinosaurs back in that day.
You think so? You think
Yes.
there were dinosaurs
I
back
believe
then?
there were dinosaurs.
If there were dinosaurs, why is it not in the Bible? Ooh, where's Ken
the
Ham?
Leviathan
Where's
is
Ken?
in
Oh,
the
he's
Bible.
wait.
Don't
What does
don't
Leviathan mean?
Here comes Job, right?
Look at Job.
Yeah, no, Leviathan is in the Bible in Job, and there was
Leviathan.
another dinosaur.
What does
in there.
Leviathan mean in Hebrew?
Behemoth.
Behemoth?
The Hemoth?
Behemoth?
And
yeah.
then there's Leviathan.
Hemlock?
No. I think...
What is Leviathan?
if I remember correctly, it was a giant reptilian creature that was described in the book of Job. I can look it up in the Bible real fast.
I think
You want me
it'd
Behemoth
be
is
fun.
in Job, isn't
It
it?
is in the book of Job.
I think
Chapter 40.
Leviathan
Let me look it
is-
up real fast.
While you're looking that up, that'd be kind of fun. So I did a little bit of just researched. Well, it's really more for my brain because I'm 52 now and I'm forgetting everything. But we all know Methuselah. Is that how you say it?
Methuselah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's an S in there. I didn't know that's how you pronounce it. And he was 969 years, right? Noah was 950. We know Adam 930. But I bet this other dude who's the second oldest. Do you remember his name?
No.
Jared.
Oh,
Yared.
yeah. That's cool.
Crazy, right? Little
Really?
trivia. Yeah. No, I'm not kidding. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 20, Jared lived 969 or 962 years.
Wow.
He was almost as old as Methuselah. Is that how you say it?
Methuselah.
Yeah.
Methuselah.
M-Dog. We'll
Well,
call him M-Dog.
You know, the reason it's such a controversy, of course, is because people don't live that long now. And, you know, the world's oldest confirmed person in modern times is 127, I think, or something of that nature.
It's 122.
122.
I looked it up
And,
Yeah.
before this
so-
podcast.
and of course, you have the critics and you have the naysayers and you have, you know, the people that want to turn the Bible into a giant book of mythology, and they say, look at this. But there are a number of different issues. Now, from a scientific point of view, the science of aging itself is not well understood. So there's a lot of, you know, scientific evidence that demonstrates that human beings could live that long in certain cases. There's also a lot of evidence that prior to Noah's flood, your atmospheric air pressure was considerably higher. So it'd be a lot like living in a hyperbaric chamber all the time, which explains a lot of the giantism we see in fossils. You know, giant ferns and giant bugs and things like this. There's that. There's, you know, you're considerably earlier in our timeline, so there's going to be by far less, you know, issues with genetic degradation. You know, these people are considerably closer to the original creation. You know, Adam and Eve presumably would have had flawless DNA strands. So their descendants, it takes a long time for those kind of genetic problems to begin to develop. There's that. You're also eating food that, again, if it was created 1,000 years ago, there's almost no genetic problems.
No
with it.
Monsanto in that. So.
Right. So, I mean, you're eating an apple that's, you know, going to be, you know, more nutritious than anything we've ever seen in our times. You got all of those things added together. It is not unlikely that people could live a long time. Now, 969 years, you mentioned the Gregorian calendar. We do not know how they were measuring a year. I mean, according to the scriptures, before the flood, there were no seasons like, you know, winter, spring, summer, like we have now. In fact, the stars were used to determine seasons, the movement of the stars. But it doesn't say how. I mean, if it moves from this mountain peak to that mountain peak and you call that a year, it might be 3 months on our calendar. I don't know. And so you don't want to be dogmatic that it was a lunar calendar of 12. Says who? Yeah. So we really don't know. So don't be dogmatic about it. They could have lived considerably longer. It could have been 969 years like we count them. It might not have been. Any way you look at it, it's not mythology. But there's one other aspect that we do need to take into consideration, and that is that Moses is, you know, editing earlier materials that he had in his possession into what we call, you know, Genesis today. So he's transcribing older records. And again, not exactly sure how that was being determined. For example, we have Sumerian records, we have Akkadian records, we have, you know, that show people living really long time periods. But were they really living that long, or was that their way of expressing honor? For example, we find in some of these records, you know, this king lived 27,000 years. Well, we know that that's not realistic, but this way of counting was about your rank. It was about, you know, so the higher rank you had, the more they assigned to you. We can see that in other early Bronze Age, written records. So they were looking at it from a different lens, and finally, our system of counting is a base 10 system. Their system of counting may have been a base 7 system. So that changes everything. Now, I'm not a math major, but the bottom line is we have a clear record that has been passed down to us. What exactly that means in our estimation today is anyone's real guess. Now, I say all of those things, and then I get immediately criticized by some of my...
You don't believe the
Right.
Bible,
I get-
and they're 960.
Right.
Yep.
I get those guys. And so let me be painfully clear for this podcast and for everybody else. I am a young earth creationist as an apologetics guy. And so young earth, though, I'm not, hyper young earth. I'm saying there's these kinds of issues that are unanswered. So we don't want to be dogmatic about it. I will say that from a scientific point of view, I cannot justify millions of years in terms of an age of the earth, not from a scientific or a biblical point of view. I'm going to say thousands, not millions, in my estimation. Nevertheless, I'm also not super dogmatic about it because of issues like this. How were they defining a year? I don't know. Was it base 7 system of counting? Was it a system of counting like the Sumerians did, where they were assigning, numbers to somebody based on their rank or their importance or something like that? We don't know for sure. What we do know is the Bible records that number. That's what we know for sure. So, lots of caveats, but still.
And ultimately, does it change the story of creation to Christ? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think.
Yes.
Does it?
110%.
No.
Oh, okay. Let me hear this.
Are you just being?
No.
He's just being. I
just
told
being
you
that
there's
kid.
that one kid.
Because for me, there's always room for discussion if it doesn't change the point of the
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it does. It doesn't affect whether or not you're going to heaven. It doesn't affect your salvation.
No.
How you see age of the earth.
Yeah.
I have good friends of mine that are old Earth creationists. We go round and round on it.
Sure.
I have good friends of mine that are hyper young Earth. It's exactly 6,000 years, and if you question that in any way, shape, or form, I mean, Dr. Brian Thomas and I, he's a friend of mine. We were driving down the road one day, and we were almost shouting at each other on this issue. As I was driving him to the airport, and we got to the airport. He said, "Well, see you later, brother."
Didn't shake hands.
Good. We're good friends, but we don't quite see eye to eye on this particular issue.
Sure.
But it doesn't affect your salvation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how did Moses and their generation understand a year? Because Moses lived a couple thousand years before Christ.
Yeah. 1,400 at least.
Yeah.
So what was his understanding of what a year was?
Right.
When he was putting that together.
Yep.
There's a lot of people like to debate some of these things all the time and make it there's some people that I'm sure make it a lifestyle, but kind of interesting. Did you say you did some research on some newer people, like recently,
Yeah.
and how old they? I want to hear what you got, because I
also
got a
have
couple
the
of those too.
Scripture on Leviathan, but we'll come back.
Yeah,
to
no,
that.
we'll come back to that for sure.
Yeah. Hold up, let me find it. Yeah, so I found out from doing some research on Google, you guys can look it up, that the oldest recorded person in modern history was 122 years.
Jean Clément.
Yeah, Jean Clément. She's French. And 164 days. She was born in 1875 and died in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
So she witnessed both world wars.
That's crazy.
Lived through both of them. And she witnessed the Greatest Generation and all that stuff. So it's fascinating. I also found that the oldest male from modern history was born in Japan in 1897.
Mr. Tanaka.
And died in 2013, and he was 116 years old in 54 days.
Yep.
So pretty old people.
I got two more. So the oldest United States citizen was Sarah Noss, and she lived to 119 years and 97 days. She just died in 1999. I keep hitting that. There we go. And she lived to 1999. And then Lucille Randon, she's actually another French. She's a French. She was the oldest verified living person at the time of passing, 118 years and 340 days. So not quite 119 years old.
So she was French too.
But what's interesting is all of them.
A lot of red wine.
Remember how?
I guess.
Sorry.
I was thinking all that.
We will edit that out.
That is not being.
It's not the
What?
French heavy cream, and it's not the French red wine. Okay,
They must be living
French
long.
have terrible wine. No, just kidding. Anyways, I'm just kidding. So, anyways, but what I noticed was they were all like right at what God said. It's not good for man to live long. We're gonna limit his 120 years. Isn't that interesting?
It is
Even to this day, like the longest ones, right there about 120 years.
Yep.
roughly. Yeah.
Pretty crazy, huh?
No, it is pretty crazy, but I think it's also recognizing that there's this life. I view this life as there was an illustration we talked about last podcast about eternity versus this life and the rope analogy. Who did that analogy?
Francis
Well, I brought it up, but it's Francis Chan.
Francis Chan, where you tape part of the rope and it was like a small portion of the rope and the rest is eternity. And it's like, so I look at this life and it feels to me almost like this life is a stepping off point into eternity. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's like a
but
springboard.
Yeah.
Sure.
I guess you could view it that way.
So does that mean like Methuselah's rope, he's got a lot more of the black tape? I'm just want to know.
Yeah, but in comparison to eternity,
In comparison to eternity, it's still
eternity's
nothing.
millions and billions of
true.
years of worth of time,
It's true. It's true.
which
so,
time works differently.
so how many of you believe that the flood was a global flood? Raise your hand. How many believe it was localized? Raise your hand.
You believe it was localized?
We're going to have that
believe it was both.
conversation.
You think
it was
both?
both?
We're going to have that
Well, if it's
conversation
global, it
next.
had to be both.
Conversation.
Yeah.
By
Okay.
definition.
Well, then first we're talking about Leviathan. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I think that's a whole other podcast when we talk about
Yeah,
dinosaurs.
Yeah,
we can,
for sure.
We can talk about that in a minute, but I still want to pull up Leviathan. If we
So,
can.
the Hebrew word there for earth, the flood of the whole earth, is
Yeah.
the land, used
Eretz.
localized.
Ha-eretz.
That's right, localized, or could be globalized. Right? It's not. That's the unknown. So you have people that argue that both sides. People quickly jump from the Bible to what they call scientific evidence
Right.
to
Yeah.
back up a global flood, and they postulate or basically stipulate, well, we have crustaceans and we have a bunch of stuff on the tallest mountains in the earth, therefore it had to be globalized. Okay. All these different cultures have some kind of historical story that talks about some kind of globalized flood.
yeah.
So, I thought we would have a little bit of fun discussing, and I'm gonna take the counterpoint just for fun because you know I will.
Yeah.
Why we
He's
think
that kid. He's
it
that
is
kid.
a global flood? Convince me, because you can't say in the Bible it says global.
I think you can. Okay, but first of all, I'm coming off my memory here, and I didn't come in here with notes. But let me just suggest the following. You have a global flood to kill a global population. First of all, because the purpose of the flood was to destroy mankind on the earth, and so if they're all over, they're all over. Now, second, I think when you talk about ha'eretz in Hebrew, it can, as you said, it can be both local and it can mean the entire planet. It depends on its context in Hebrew. So that it is unclear in that sense because it can be used both ways. I personally obviously favor the global flood point of view, both biblically and scientifically. That's my position on it. I think I have very, very good evidence worldwide of a worldwide flood. There's just too much evidence, in fact, in my view, to come to any other conclusion. That's just my point of view.
And you want to know one of the biggest forms of evidence for the flood?
Sure.
Dinosaurs. Boom!
I ain't never seen no dinosaur.
It's dinosaur fossils, man. Do you know how hard it is for a fossil to be made without like a flood of some kind or like a worldwide flood? So fossils are formed when, correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's when an animal dies and then it gets covered by sediments from water. And then that, I can't remember what it does with the bones, but it
mineralizes.
It mineralizes on the bones. And
you
keeps
have
the
to have a
structure of
certain matrix, and you have to have a certain warmth. You have to have temperature. You have to have a certain salinity in your water. There's a number of different factors that lead to fossilization because it's a replacement of bone material with minerals. That's what it is. It basically turns it into stone.
But we have what's called fossil graveyards, where there are
do.
entire sections of sediments that we found where there are thousands
Try
of
millions.
fossils, actually millions of fossils. And most of these fossils are of multiple different animal species, many of which should not be in the same general layers if you're thinking from an evolutionary point of view.
Very
For
true.
instance, there have been mammal fossils, I believe, found with dinosaur fossils mixed with seawater fossils or sea life fossils. I can't remember the exact on some of these graveyards.
There's a
but
lot of those types of things you would have to, scour the literature for.
Yeah,
that. I
I'll
can
have
think
to
of,
look.
off the top of my
but-
head, I can think of the Karoo Formation, which I know they estimate somewhere around 1 trillion different fish fossils all in one spot.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that just doesn't happen in any, no modern observation shows this kind of thing happening.
And
So
it's
go ahead.
very difficult to explain those kinds of fossils unless, of course, there was a worldwide flood that picked up trillions of tons of sediments and mixed it in with all the livestock that it killed and basically fossilized all of those fish into sections of groups.
And we also have to keep in mind that, the Bible does not give us, it's an observational book.
Yeah.
It's not
Yes.
it's not a scientific textbook. So it does say in Genesis that the fountains of the great deep were broken up. We believe now that we can correlate that directly to plate tectonics, what many creationist scientists are calling catastrophic plate tectonics.
Yeah.
The evidence is very, very strong for this. We have a lot of good evidence of that. And, when you're moving hundreds of trillions of tons of sediment, at a time, it's going to rapidly bury.
Absolutely.
But you have so much evidence. I was thinking of there's a formation in they call it Hell Creek Canyon in
I've heard of
Montana,
this
Wyoming
one.
area
Oh,
up
this
there
was
somewhere.
cool. Yeah.
And it extends, quite a ways. And creationist scientists have been doing a lot of excavations of Edmontosaurus and Triceratops and things like this that they've discovered there. And what they've found is that these skeletons, it's obvious that they've been transported from one place to another. They're beat up. They're like ground up. I mean, these animals, and they were not small animals. We were looking at a Triceratops with a skull that's 7 feet long. So, I mean, this is not a small animal. And yet they're jumbled up. I mean, the amount of water to move something like that, and thousands of these creatures, and they're all jumbled together, and they're digging them out of the ground. And you can even see in the bones the evidence of that grinding. Only massive amounts of water could do this. And local floods just cannot support that kind of evidence.
The other thing,
And
too,
so-
is worldwide layers of sediments.
Yes.
Because when you look at sediments, a good example is a few hours north from here. I don't know if you guys know this, but we're in Arizona, which means a few hours north of here, the Grand Canyon is way up there. And they've looked, a lot of these sediment layers that you see in the Grand Canyon and canyons like the Grand Canyon are that can only be laid down from intense rushing water that happens rapidly.
You
and
can
you can
prove
see
that.
this pattern in the layers when geologists look at it. And we've actually confirmed from modern volcanic eruptions, mudslides, and local floods that's how a lot of these sediment layers form quickly. A good example is Mount St. Helens in 1980. There was a volcanic eruption. It caused massive mudslides, and these mudslides literally formed canyons. Some of them, I think, were super deep within a matter of hours, and it laid down sediments from the mudslides that looked very similar to the same kinds of sediment layers we see literally worldwide. And one of the areas that we see most of these sediments is where these fossil graveyards are.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of interesting evidence, and I'm pretty sure there's more that we have too.
Oh, there's tons
There's
more.
tons
I mean,
more. But
that's the reason that I personally am a global flood believer is, this evidence that you're talking about. I mean, for the Grand Canyon, for example, when you mention sediment layers, we can look at the types of grains and we can look at the, what's in them, and we can see that this layer extends all the way across, the entire United States. I mean, it's not just in one place.
yeah,
And so, I mean, the amount of water that would had to have come through there to lay a sandstone layer, like the Tapete sandstone layer, for example,
Yeah.
that spreads all the way across the continent and all the way down into the Gulf of America.
Oh,
Oh, here we go.
here we go.
Just getting it, politically correct. but yeah, we got this evidence
America.
so we've got this evidence of these massive layers that extend all the way across continents.
Yeah.
Again, local floods cannot explain that.
Where did all the water go?
Great question.
Look out at the Pacific Ocean. Look out at the Atlantic Ocean.
But that doesn't cover
73%
the
of this
Earth.
planet.
Well-
73% of this planet currently is underwater, and they estimate now. Scientists are telling us that there's almost twice as much water in the mantle below our feet.
Yeah.
Right now. And so the Bible talks about the breaking up of the great deep. Prior to the flood, it's described that springs came up all over the planet. So there was this water that we currently see in the mantle right now. Most of it was, which we call the Pacific and the Atlantic and things like that today, were underground. Now, what we think happened, and Dr. Baumgartner has done a really brilliant job on this, if you want to look him up, that prior to the Great Flood, there was what we would call today the Pacific Plate, the tectonic plate.
Yeah.
So it's heavy basalt, and it snapped, dropping into the mantle. And when it did, it flash boiled hundreds of trillions of tons of seawater instantaneously up into the sky, which would have caused absolutely torrential rains, 40 days and 40 nights. But that's not the primary. The primary flood was when the plates, the tectonics, snapped like that. You literally had a wobbling effect all the way across the planet. And so this would have caused massive tidal waves that came in succession, which is why you have one set of sediment, then another set of sediment, and then another set, is because these waves would have gotten progressively larger and higher. So your lower elevations would have been inundated first, hence the reason when you're looking at your fossils that the lowest part of your geologic column is going to be marine fossils. So things that were, in reefs close to the shore, not in deep water, those would have been inundated first. And then the next wave would have come, and then it would have been a little higher and a little higher. And of course, your, animals, they're going to go for high ground, on that.
Yeah.
And so we see plenty of evidence of that because as you're moving up the geologic layers, you're seeing different types of animals and things like that, depending on where, that flood came. But the plates were moving, they estimate meters per second. I mean, that's how fast things were moving. And well, when you're going to have massive, massive volcanism, again, which we can prove, like the Columbia River Plateau, for example, you've got 200,000 square miles, nearly 2 miles deep of basalt coming from volcanic eruption. We don't see anything like that in eruptions anywhere in modern history. But if you had a massive plate snapping off like that and dropping into the mantle, that's the kind of thing you would get. And we have evidence of that. Well, that's going to affect your atmosphere. It's going to affect, again, the tsunamis that would have spread. So it's not like, we kind of get the picture of global flood and we think, well, if we were in a satellite and we were looking down, all we would see is water. That's not it. It would have been more like successive tsunamis covering higher and higher ground. But you also see that as the plates began to settle back, they buckled because they're going to hit one another, and that's going to push up your mountains. Well, these sediment layers were still relatively soft at that time, hence the reason we look and we see sediments that are bent. You can see them when you're driving down the road, and they cut through a hill or something. You can see these sediments. They're at angles or they're whatever, but they're not cracked or snapped. If that had happened over millions of years, you would have seen massive erosion between layers, but we see none. Okay, you would have seen all kinds of cracking, and that's what happens with rocks when you put them under pressure. So they're going to crack or snap. We don't see that. They're all, they're just bent. In some places, it's amazing. Some of these bends are like 90 degrees. Okay, well, that's because they were soft. I mean, mud would do that. Now, as mud dries, it also cracks, and when you lift it, it's kind of, if you go to the beach and you put your hand under some sand, wet sand, and just lift your hand up, you're going to get a bulge, and then you're going to get cracks. And within those cracks, water is going to flow. And that's where you get things like the Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon, Zion, things like that. That's where that comes from. And so the geology, now I'm not a geologist, but, I've read good geologists like Dr. Baumgartner or Dr. Austin. These are guys that have studied this stuff at great length. Austin in particular, he's the one that took, a lot of that evidence from Mount St. Helens.
That was pretty cool.
That was really neat, because they literally blocked, a stream was blocked by almost 200 feet of sediment, and it's finely layered, but it cracked and the water flowed through and cut a canyon, and now it's as hard as stone, and that was only since 1980. And if you didn't know better, you would have thought, each one of those layers was a single, was individual eruptions, one after the other, but it was actually only one. It was laid down within 9 hours. So we have evidence from a real event in real time that we have studied to show that these kinds of things can happen very rapidly. In fact, most of your geologists have given up on uniformitarianism over the years, and now they've come to what they called episodicity, or uniformitarianism is the idea that layers are laid down in very, 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 very slowly over millions, tens of thousands, millions of years. But catastrophic or catastrophism or episodicity is the idea that major episodes like Mount St. Helens can create these massive landforms in quickly. Well, we can prove that.
Yeah, I think for me, the scientific aspect of it is, most of our metals, most of our dirt, most of our, we'll call it materials, raw materials of the earth, it all has a weight. It all has a weight. Like sand's very light, basaltic's a little bit heavier, iron is very heavy. Your precious metals are super heavy. And so it makes a lot of sense, like in a Mount St. Helens kind of episode where you've got this massive flow, right?
Yeah.
Well, how is it going to put a whole bunch of different layers, even different colors, all at the same time? Well, you just go back to weights and measures.
Yep.
You basically have all your sand is at a certain level, all your basalt's at a certain level, when it's flowing in a liquefaction state, basically.
Yeah.
And so that goes back to the whole, well, it just happened very slowly over millions of years. Well, not necessarily. In fact, there's a bunch of videos out there where it even shows, like, whether it's Zion or Bryce or even in the Grand Canyon, that when there is a monsoon downpour of just 1 inch, literally tens of thousands of tons of sediment is moved. Very, very rapidly and quickly. So it doesn't even need to be, for example, global wide to get monster moves, although I'm not saying it's not global either.
No. Do you remember last year when we went to Zion?
Yeah.
Okay, we went down that canyon and all the water that was in it. Oh, it's cold.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, but anyway.
Yeah, it was.
But you could see, I remember, and I'm sure you remember too, as we're going down the canyon, the sand that's coming right off the sandstone, as you get it on your hands as you're going through the canyon, it's still eroding even now. And one good storm, all of a sudden, last year this wasn't here. I mean, a gigantic hole. But I also remember when we were at Zion, I took video there showing the layers that you can see in that sandstone.
Yeah.
And you can see the angle of what's called cross bedding. And they've studied this in the lab. The cross bedding is consistent with being underwater at high speeds. The water was moving very fast. The angle is consistent with that, whereas if it had been laid down by air, like sand dunes, completely different angle. I can't remember the exact numbers, and it's not beyond my pay grade. But anyway, but I've took pictures of it myself. And again, and I even showed on my video, I said, look here, you can see where this ends because you can see where the water was going this way. And then now the crossbed comes back this way and there's no erosion between.
Yeah.
See, and if that had taken millions of years, you would have had an erosion event between where the direction changed on the flow of this sediment. but it's right there. It's right there in the side of the road. We just stopped and I took pictures of it, and it's obvious. So
Yeah. What do you think, Pastor David, on this real fast before we conclude this podcast?
Well, I mean, so I'm usually, when I read the Bible, I try to take that for my main source, and I do see that God was trying to wipe out the human race. So I feel like it would have to be global.
Could you move the microphone a little bit closer? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
You
Sorry.
may. Maybe Michael's keeping me quiet.
Michael, turn them up.
So there's obviously, but there is a theory out there, and you guys have all heard it, but I think it makes the most sense to me, was that geographically, if you look, it's like the earth is a puzzle, right? And all the different continents look very much like they could have been one spot. That's why I said local and worldwide, because I think if it was all together, that's the whole world. They cover that whole, and then of course breaks up and turns into what it is now. It makes sense of why we've found Australian animals in other places that they didn't feel like they should. There's a lot of unanswerable questions, and to me that, for me at least, it makes a lot of sense to say, hey, something.
There's certainly much more scientific evidence for a global flood
For sure.
than a localized flood.
I'm in agreement with that, and I think it's biblically sound too.
But at the end of the day, this is just fun mysteries that we're talking about regarding the Bible. We don't need to know this information for sure in order to get to heaven or to know Jesus one-on-one.
Absolutely true.
So with that, I think we're going to conclude this episode of the podcast. So thank you, everybody, for watching episode 15 of the Calvary Chapel 14:6 podcast. We appreciate you guys so much. And thank you guys so much for supporting this series. We have reached over 5,000 people in this series alone who have watched us consecutively all over this series. So thank you guys so much for watching us consistently. We really appreciate it. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you guys in the next one.
Adios.
Bye.
See ya.